Question on the whiteboard today. What for you is a favorite like family trip or activity? Nice on with watching movies. It's always a good one. Say for me, my grandparents used to live on an island in the middle of Lake Michigan called Beaver Island. That we'd like go up there and visit them every summer, and that was like the coolest uh, because it's kind of just it's a different society. Like there's no fast food restaurants at all. There's no big stores like Walmart or Target or anything like that. Um, so it's kind of just a really cool place to like get away from everything every year. So that would be my pick. How about the rest of you? Anyone else have a like favorite family memory, whether it's going out and doing something or even hanging out at the house? While you're thinking about that, in the course for today is assigned your Unit 3 test. But again, because we kind of have this awkward every other day class connect schedule, we're going to go ahead and start Unit 4 in class here today. So if you want to grab the Unit 4 study guide, it is posted right at the top of Unit 4. I would assume I also put it on the course announcements for this week. And cool, here's some other answers in the chat. Uh, nice, Julian going to Nashville with dad. Doing a Bigfoot convention. I love it. That's awesome. Cool, cool. Feel free to share others. But we'll go ahead and go to the vocab slide so people can start jot the vocabulary down. But a reminder with us taking the Unit 3 test this week. Again, you should always go into the test being as prepared as possible. I would always recommend by filling out the study guide for the unit. Um, because also, then, if you end up not being happy with your test grade, you can earn a test retake by emailing me a completed study guide for that unit. But as a reminder, don't just try to quickly Google the answers on the study guide because Google's not going to pull up the right information from you. Half the time, it's not even going to pull up information tied to government. So I'm going to look at that study guide and in 5 seconds, I'm going to be like, oh no, none of this is right. You have to actually find the answers in the course that line up with what's going to be on the test. So just a heads up there. But all right, give me one moment here to send out the email to those who are running late. And we will get going. All right. So I think Unit 4 is actually my favorite unit of the government class. I think there's a lot of things that are really interesting to talk about as a government nerd. Um, but I think Unit 4 also is especially relevant to students because it's talking about well, how do people develop their political views and how do people get involved in government or have an impact in government? And so, what we're going to start off with is talking about voting in the United States. And today, we're going to kind of quickly go through the history of voting in the United States. And then on Friday, we'll kind of talk about voting and political participation in the United States today. Uh, but as a starting point, to the best of your knowledge, or if you had to take a guess, who all gets to vote in elections in America today? Excellent, Anita. Yeah. So pretty much everyone, as noted, you have to be 18 or older, because that is the year that the government identifies people as being an adult. And then, excellent, Julian. Generally speaking, you have to be a U.S. citizen. Um, there are some communities that might allow um, non-citizens to vote in things like school board elections. But when it comes to like state and federal elections, yes, you have to be a U.S. citizen in order to vote. So you got to be a U.S. citizen. You got to be 18 years of age or older. Generally speaking, you also have to not be in jail. Most states will not let you vote if you are currently serving time in jail. Many states won't let you vote if you're then on probation. Some states don't let you vote until you then fill out a form and essentially pay a fee to get your voting rights back. That's something that can vary from state to state, but generally speaking, if you're serving time in jail, you also can't vote. But otherwise, as long as you're a US citizen and you're 18 years old, you can vote. Now, again, to the best of your knowledge, has this always been the case in the United States that everyone who is a citizen and 18 years old can vote? And yeah, the answer would be no. How come? Who or what might not have been able to vote in America's past, or how have things changed? Yeah, as Julian notes, generally speaking, in early US history, it used to be only white males that could vote, ultimately excluding a large percentage of the country from participating in our democracy. And so that's what we're really going to kind of dive into today, is that expansion of voting rights over the course of US history, or suffrage, as it's also known. Um, Suffrage is really just a fancy vocab term for having the right to vote. So oftentimes in like history class, they talk about the fight for women's suffrage, and that doesn't mean suffering. That's a very different word. It means women fighting for their right to vote. And yes, Samantha, to your comment, yes. It used to be that, generally speaking, 21 was the minimum age to vote. And we'll also talk about how that changed today as well. Sometimes you also hear the phrase political franchise used. Again, that's just another way of saying voting rights. So voting, suffrage, political franchise, they all mean the same thing. They're talking about being able to participate in elections, going to a voting location and voting. But as Julian noted, while America has been a representative democracy since our country's beginning, in the sense that we have held elections to select people to represent us in government, historically, the ability to participate in that democracy was limited. If we were to go back to the 1780s, generally speaking, you had to be white, you had to be a male, you had to be an adult, and in many states, you had to own property, you had to own land. Which even further reduced the ability to participate in our democracy. It for example, meant that a lot of lower income Americans, even if they were white men, couldn't participate in our democracy. And so, if you were to go back and kind of do the math of excluding all of the people who couldn't vote in the United States early on, we're talking about 75% of the country couldn't vote. Which at that point, that does kind of raise the question, are you really a democracy if you're only letting 25% of the country participate in elections? I don't know if there's a clear answer to that, but that does kind of get to a point where that doesn't feel super democratic at that point. It feels like you're excluding a lot of people from the voting process. And so, one of our challenges as a country has been to better live up to that value of being a representative democracy, making sure that all Americans have the opportunity to participate in our democracy, which that's basically what you're seeing here. What this chart is showing you is what percent of the country's total population voted in presidential elections. And so come over here to early US history, the late 1700s. Roughly speaking, what percent of Americans voted in those early presidential elections? If you kind of just gave a rough estimate based on the chart. Roughly speaking, at what percent does this blue line begin at? So we'd want to see where this blue line is, and then we'd want to check the percentage markers here. Where does this blue line be? Yeah, it's super low. It's clearly under 5%, and it's pretty far below 5%. So yeah, we're talking 1 to 2% of the country participated in early presidential elections. Again, that doesn't feel super democratic at that point. If your election participation is really just like 2% of the country. But as you can see, that blue line has gone up over time. It's around this point that we got rid of the property requirement. So we can see a significant jump in participation there. It's around this point that we get the 15th Amendment that clarifies that African Americans can vote. So we see a little bit of a spike here. We see a dramatic jump here going into the 1820s. That's because at that point, then women had the right to vote. And so as we get closer to modern day, this chart ends at 2012, but approximately what percent of the country's population votes today? Excellent, Ania. Yeah, we can see here the blue line is just over 40%. So yeah, something like 41% in 2012. It was a little bit lower in 2016, if I remember correctly, and then had a decent increase going into 2020. Part of that was because it was easier for people to vote by mail in 2020 with COVID and all of that, so that helped there. Now, note, it's never going to be 100% because we, for example, don't let children vote. We don't let non-citizens vote. So this number's never going to be 100%. And clearly, we've improved a lot over time. Going from 1 to 2% to over 40%. That's obviously growth. That's improvement. But there's also still room to do better. And we'll talk more about that on Friday. But if you take a look back on U.S. history, a big chunk of it is tied to different groups of Americans fighting to expand voting rights. to make sure that they are included in the democratic process. Um, for women, it was a fight that took over 100 years. Um, you have women in the early 1800s pushing for the right to vote, um, like Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Um, Women who will dedicate the entirety of their adult lives fighting for the right to vote and not see it become a reality before they pass away, as women don't ultimately get the protected right to vote until 1920. Um, but for example, one of the things Susan B. Anthony is famous for is at one point her deciding, to heck with it. I don't care what the law says. I'm going to go vote as an American anyway. My gender shouldn't matter. And so one presidential election, she showed up to vote, basically, bullied the voting attendant to give her a ballot so that she could cast a vote. And then later on, the police showed up and arrested her because she had broken the law. And she went to court over it. And, Susan B. Anthony was a smart woman. She knew that was likely to be the consequence of her action. Yet she did it anyway. Why? What do you think? Why might she have done something that she knew was going to get her into legal trouble for doing so? What might have been her thought process or her reasoning behind that? Because normally we encourage people to not break the law. But this is a case where Susan B. Anthony is kind of celebrated for doing it. Why? Certainly one, took bravery to do it. But it also takes like bravery to like rob a bank, I suppose. We don't normally celebrate that. So why do we celebrate this act of bravery? As Julian notes, I think there is a point she's trying to prove. Imagine if something like this were to happen today. If you read on the news that a woman had been arrested for trying to vote, what would your reaction to that be? Hearing that multiple police officers showed up at a woman's house to arrest her because she voted. Mad, I think, is a very fair response. Because from our modern day perspective, that obviously seems ridiculous. That, of course, women should have the right to vote. What a what a stupid waste of everyone's time and tax dollars to go around arresting women for voting. And so what Susan B. Anthony is ultimately engaging in is an act of civil disobedience. It is her purposely breaking a law that she believes is unjust in order to kind of shine a spotlight on the injustice of it. Because ultimately this story then got into the newspapers of Susan B. arrested for voting. And it helped bring attention to this issue of like, wait, this is absurd. Now, a key piece of civil disobedience is that you accept the consequences of your actions. Um, when the police come and arrest Susan B. Anthony, she doesn't start yelling and screaming and like throwing punches at the police. Um, because at that point, what do you think people's reaction would have been if they had read about that in the news? That, Susan B. Anthony, was yelling and punching at police when they came to arrest her. How would that maybe kind of defeat her mission at that point? Exactly, Anya. That would have been easy ammunition for those who were against women voting to then say, well, see, this is why women shouldn't vote. Women are too emotional. They're unpredictable. We can't trust them with voting. Of course, that's all utter nonsense. But that probably would have been the argument made. So that is a key piece of civil disobedience is, Susan B. Anthony broke a law she viewed as being unjust, but she also accepted the consequences of doing that as a form of protest. She accepted that she was getting arrested. She went to court, but when she had her moment to finally speak in court, she said, "The only chance women have for justice in this country is to violate the law, as I have done, and as I shall continue to do." Now, this was no easy fight. As noted here on the poster on the right of what I would do with the suffragists, which again would be women fighting for the right to vote, what does this poster maybe suggest about the attitude some people had towards women voting in America? What does this poster seem to suggest the creator would want to do to the women that were trying to fight for the right to vote? Yeah, it's really a disturbing poster when you take a moment to kind of get past the cartooniness of it. Of yeah, silencing women, keeping them quiet, physically restraining them. This was not an easy fight for women. Again, it took over 100 years. There was strong resistance, not just from men in society. There were a lot of women in America who didn't want women to have the right to vote, who believed that was not within women's nature because that's what they had been told their entire life is, okay, well, men do this and women do that. And voting's not part of that equation. It wasn't just about making a couple of parades or giving a couple of speeches. It took real hard work and it took risks. Women got arrested, they went to jail, they were physically assaulted. They had to try to overcome sexist prejudices. You kind of see it here. This was a common argument of like, well, women are too pure to get involved in politics. Politics is dirty business. We don't want to expose women to that kind of dirtiness. And so women kind of having to like spin that for the time period of like, oh, well, if politics are dirty, maybe women can clean that up. It was a long, hard fight until you eventually get the 19th Amendment in 1920, which clarifies that the right to vote can't be denied because of a person's sex. We also see a long, hard fight for racial minorities to get the right to vote. Technically, racial minorities should have had the protected right to vote after the Civil War. With the ratification of the 15th Amendment in the aftermath of the Civil War, which ends in 1865. However, many states, especially in the South, found loopholes, different ways to continue to make it difficult, if not impossible, for African Americans to vote. And so, flash forward to the 1960s, basically 100 years after the Civil War, and we have the efforts of the civil rights movement fighting for African American voting rights. And again, this was not an easy fight. This wasn't just having parades and marches. There were real risks and danger, especially because oftentimes Southern states would use the power of law enforcement to try to disrupt these efforts at fighting for voting rights, um, such as in the March for Selma, um, where you have a large group of law enforcement at the Edmund Pettus Bridge um, physically assault a group of peaceful marchers, breaking up that march. Ultimately, you have things like the passing of the Civil or the Voting Rights Act of 1965, um, which helps eliminate a lot of those barriers to African Americans voting. Um, but that fight continues. Um, we continue to see state and local government make changes to elections that members within the African American community, as well as other minority groups, claim or argue um, is intended to discriminate against them. Um, Again, multiple southern states, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, have recently been found guilty in court to have been gerrymandering their election maps to try to water down the African American vote. Um, and so the fight continues. I think sometimes as Americans, we may like to think of like, okay, yeah, things weren't good in the past, but we fixed all of that. It's all good now. Um, Many would argue the fight continues. Progress has been made, but progress could continue. And I think an important thing to kind of take some time reflecting on is how much so many Americans sacrificed for the right to vote. They sacrificed time, money, sometimes their lives. Um, People have bled for the right to vote. People have died fighting for the right to vote in the United States. And I think that raises a really important question. Why? Um, the reality is, frankly, a lot of Americans don't care a whole lot about voting. And we'll talk more about that on Friday. So I want us to think about this as a critical thinking challenge. Take some time to think about it. Send me your thoughts as a private chat message. But trying to put ourselves in the shoes of the people of the past, what might be a reason why people were willing to fight so hard and make tremendous sacrifices just to gain the right to vote? Why might they have viewed that as so important? Why would they potentially view that as being something worth dying for? Because some of them did. So take 5 minutes to think about that and send me your thoughts. We'll come back here then at 9:50. And you got about a minute and a half left to send me your response if you haven't sent me something already. All right. If you're still typing up a response, that's fine. Finish it up. But let me grab some of what I have here so far. Um, all right. Take a moment to read some of what your peers came up with. I think there's some really important thoughts here. Um, many of you saying, these people probably felt or fought so hard um, because they wanted to have a voice. They wanted to have a seat at the table, so to speak. Um, this idea of fighting for equality, and really hitting upon an important idea here of voting kind of being a starting point. Because for example, think about the challenges women faced back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Um, Women were denied access to a lot of schools and educational facilities because of their gender. They were not considered for a lot of jobs and careers because of their gender. When they did have the exact same job as men, they um, were paid significantly less, even though they were doing the exact same work as their male coworkers. Um, Back then, it was a lot harder for women to get a divorce or to get out of an abusive relationship. Um, so there were a lot of serious issues women faced during this time period. Yet, the issue they fought hardest for was the right to vote. And you might at first look at that and say, well, that doesn't make sense. Some of those other issues seem more important. Why focus on voting first? And the idea, as mentioned here, is that voting was viewed as being the key that would unlock all of the other progress that needed to be made. That once women could vote, they could start to elect people to government that would address the other issues that women were facing at that time. Or the same thing for African Americans wanting to have that right to vote. Oftentimes in the past, government had been used to legally discriminate against African Americans. And so part of the thought process was that, if African Americans had a right to vote, they could start electing people to government that would no longer use government to discriminate against them, and could start voting for politicians that would push for equal protection under the law. Um, and so that is why voting was viewed as being so important and so valuable to these Americans. And so I think that's something that's really important for us to keep in mind today. Because again, as we'll talk about on Friday, a lot of Americans, but especially young Americans, don't vote. They don't view it as being important. They don't think it matters. They don't think it's a big deal. It is a big deal. You have past generations of Americans who literally died so that you have the right to vote today. That is ultimately your choice to decide if you will use that right or not. But I would personally argue we do a disservice to our ancestors who sacrificed so much in order to make sure we all have the right to vote today. It takes, it's one day of the year. For most people, it takes less than an hour to do. But it's a way to honor and respect those who sacrificed, bled, and died for that right to vote. And so over the course of U.S. history, we have seen that push to expand voting rights. Again, in the aftermath of the Civil War, we get the 15th Amendment in 1870, which says the right to vote can't be denied based on race, which again, theoretically should have meant that African Americans and other racial minority groups would now have a protected right to vote. And for a moment there, we really did see voter participation expand among African Americans. However, once white Southerners regained control of state governments in the South, they found new ways to block African Americans from voting. Things like poll taxes, literacy tests. We'll talk more about that in a later unit. So that fight ended up being ongoing. Then it's not until 1920 that we get the 19th Amendment, which says the right to vote can't be denied based on a person's sex, which is basically what guaranteed that women would have the right to vote. So as mentioned, many Southern states started putting in place what are called poll taxes, basically a tax or a fee you would have to pay before you could vote. That was put in place in order to largely block African Americans from voting, because especially in the past, many African Americans lived in poverty because of the legacy of slavery. So they really couldn't afford to spend money to vote. If you're struggling to put food on the table to feed your kids, it's really hard to justify, spending some money to go vote. So the 24th Amendment addressed that by outlawing poll taxes. So a person can no longer be denied the right to vote for failure to pay a poll tax or any other kind of tax. And then finally, in 1971, we get the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age, which was largely 21 across the country, to 18. And this was a change that was largely accomplished by young people, literally your age. Because at that point in time, you were in the middle of the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War had a draft, which meant men starting at the age of 18 could get drafted into the military and have to go fight in the Vietnam War. Well, a lot of young people looked at that and said, something doesn't add up here. Because what do you think? If you were in that situation, what would you think about the fact that you could get drafted at 18, but you couldn't vote until 21? What might be your thoughts or reaction to that? Might seem rather stupid. How come? Yeah, exactly, Julian. A lot of young people made that same argument of saying, okay, so a person at the age of 18 is old enough to, you know, be handed a gun, taught to be a soldier, and potentially go die over in Vietnam, but they're not old enough to vote. Um, for many young people at the time, that didn't make any sense. You know, if a person was old enough to go fight and die for their country, certainly they also should be viewed as old enough to vote. And so young people built a movement to push for the 26th Amendment to lower the voting age to 18. And they got it done. Um, and note they had to do that without the internet. So they couldn't just all get on social media and organize that way. They had to make phone calls. They had to write letters. They had to organize meetings. Um, they organized marches. They organized campaigns to write to members of Congress, to go meet with members of government, to put pressure on government to make a change. And they got it done. And so I see this attitude all the time that government's just going to do what government's going to do. That government doesn't listen to the people, government doesn't change anything. So why bother? What a waste of time. That kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because yeah, if everyone thinks government is a waste of time and no one bothers to interact with government, well then government's just going to do whatever the people in government want to do. It's not until people get off their butts and say, hey, this issue is important. I'm going to do something about this and build a movement that things get done. And they happen. We've now looked at multiple examples where everyday Americans said, hey, what's going on in this country right now? It's not right. I'm not okay with it. I think it should change. And they did something about it. It's not easy. It doesn't happen overnight. Again, women had to fight 100 years to get the right to vote. But that change is possible. But if you end up having an entire generation who just says, oh, I don't really care about politics or nothing's ever going to change, it's never going to get any better, then yeah, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is exactly what is going to happen if you just have an entire generation of young people who have that attitude. Yeah, nothing is going to change because it's just going to keep being the same people in charge at that point. Um, change happens from the bottom up. Um, so ultimately, here in the United States, when we have elections, when people vote, um, winners are generally determined by what's called first past the post method, which means whoever gets the most votes wins the race. And you may hear that and go like, well, yeah, duh. How else would you figure out who the winner is? But for example, some countries do proportional voting, meaning whatever percent of votes a party gets, that's how many seats they get in government. But because here in the United States, we do first past the post, that is one of the main reasons why we tend to just have two political parties. Because if you try to create a third political party, you're ultimately going to take votes away from the party you have more in common with and probably make it more likely that the party you disagree with the most wins the election. Um, and so that's why, at this point I mean, what, 150 years? We've basically just had the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Um, and it's kind of a matter of finding Well, which party do you align with more? You're probably not going to perfectly agree with either political party, um, but which party do you find you have more in common with and maybe can kind of nudge to go in the direction you wanted to go over time? And so those will be some things we'll dig into in future Class Connects. There is one exception to this whole first past the post method. The election of the president. That is determined by the Electoral College. We'll get into the details of it in Unit 5. But it's a strange system that sometimes means the person who got the most votes to be president doesn't actually become president, doesn't actually win the election. So those will be some things we explore in future Class Connects. But I see we are basically out of time, so we will end there for today. As always, if you have any questions or you want more information about anything, maybe today caused you to think more about registering to vote, for example. As I mentioned, you can always reach out if you need help with figuring out that process. Indiana has a primary election coming up here in May. The deadline to register for that is in early April, if I remember correctly. But otherwise, you are good to go. I'll see you back here on Friday. You too, Julian. See ya. Thanks, Zion. Bye.